And finally, I want to bring together some strands that some of you noted about seeming inconsistencies in treatment of intersex children, say, and older adolescent children who identify as trans and the sort of healthcare that they might be seeking. So just to start with that distinction briefly, children who are born with intersex traits are often operated on without their input. And many of you have raised skepticism about that or moral critiques about whether that should be permitted. On the other hand, as some of you noted, older adolescents who are maybe 16, 17, 18 might be seeking modifications of their body for a sense of gendered coherence between their body and their sense of self and how they move through the society. And some of the legislation that's going through various states now seeks to pretty radically prohibit any form of what's sometimes called gender affirming care for anyone under the age of 18. And some of them are now going beyond that and prohibiting all such care or most such care, even for trans adults up to the age of 25 in some cases, or possibly even beyond that. So there is one example I'll just dig into, and then I'll tie it back to those concepts about autonomy and integrity and so forth. I was reviewing a draft of an Alabama bill some months back, and I noticed that it talked about the need to protect the bodily integrity of children as a seeming value. And so they said, for that reason, we're going to forbid, I believe it was hormonal treatments and surgeries for gender affirmation in youths under the age of 18. But there were not literally asterisks, but basically caveats that were put into the bill where they said, well, in the case of children with what they call intersex disorders or disorders of sex development, I'm not sure if they use the term intersex, they say, well, it's okay to do surgeries in those cases. And then they say, oh, and penile circumcision, it's okay to do that too. So one way of thinking about this is, well, what do they think is really at stake? I've written a piece which is online, it's just a blog post, but my impression of this was that the motivation of those in the Alabama legislation is that rather than a sort of principled understanding of the value of bodily integrity in young people, whatever that might mean, and we'll think about that over the course of this lecture, an alternative explanation for this peculiar pattern of exceptions is that the bills are really trying to present a view of gender normality and how bodies are gendered in a way that's acceptable to the dominant culture. So on this view, a child with indeterminate sex characteristics or sex characteristics that are considered to be ambiguous or that are considered to threaten the view that they're really just males and females in this mutually exclusive and exhaustive sense that is the dominant view about gender as a binary, well, children with intersex traits seem to threaten that in some view. And so if surgery is required, even if it's non-consensual, and even if it in some sense infringes on their bodily integrity, well, the dominant view is that that should be permitted. I'm speaking of really perhaps more conservative view. Maybe that's a better way of phrasing it. I don't have a recent poll of what the dominant views are in terms of the majority attitudes in the United States currently. But let's just say the conservative view. A conservative or traditional view about gender is that there's two sexes, males and females. There are also two normative gender roles. Males should grow up to be and act like boys and men, according to whatever are the standards for masculinity in their culture. Females ought to grow up and occupy a social gender role and a personal gender identity as girls and women, according to the normative standards for femininity in their culture. And so anything that threatens this, which some scholars refer to as the dominant gender ideology, on a conservative or a traditional view, should be managed in some way, including potentially through surgery. So you can start to see how this fits a bunch of different examples together. Penile circumcision is allowed on this view in the United States anyway, where it's a dominant custom, because it's a way of normalizing the penis. It's a way of making males from the time of birth sort of man up, as it were, and to undergo a painful experience, to craft their body into the way that's seen as being acceptable for boys. And so it's a kind of a gender normalizing surgery for males that's permitted under something like the Alabama worldview. Female circumcision is not allowed on this view, even the relatively minor forms, because it's seen as a foreign practice. It's seen as something that is coming with immigrants, that is what they do and is not what we do. So if I'm trying to imagine I'm trying to preserve the dominant gender ideology, well, forbidding foreign associated practices is one way that I can do that in a way that's somewhat orthogonal to the specific details of what's actually done. Intersex surgeries, as I mentioned, are a way of trying to conform bodies to fit in the mutually exclusive and exhaustive binary view of gender. Um, and so that all kind of makes sense on the dominant gender view. And then what about transgender modifications? Well, those are violations of the dominant view. Males, as we recall, according to this view, are meant to grow up and occupy masculine roles, and females are meant to grow up and occupy feminine roles. And so if you have a trans person or a non-binary person who is complicating that prescription, then you can see the conservative forces rush in and they wish to prevent those surgeries. So I'm putting my cards on the table here. My genuine best explanation of this peculiar pattern of results, according to which penile circumcision is allowed, intersex surgeries are allowed, female circumcision is not allowed, even the pricking forms, because it's associated with Islam and immigrant groups, whereas any form of transgender body modification is disallowed on these conservative bills. It doesn't seem to map onto some consistent view about a right to bodily integrity or the value of bodily intactness or something like that. My impression, and I'd be curious to hear your views and your feedback, is that it's more readily explained, more productively explained as a form of gender policing rather than as a form of a principled view about bodily integrity. One comment I wanted to make is that several of you point out that some surgeries that are done in the case of children with intersex traits are medically necessary on any view, that if you don't intervene immediately, then the child has a sort of life-threatening problem that needs to be addressed. And so I just want to clarify that when I talk about an intersex surgery, or particularly an intersex normalizing surgery, I'm always only referring to surgeries that are done for purposes of gender normalization. In other words, for purposes of conforming the child's body to what is normatively expected within their culture in a physical and a functional sense, rather than due to anything that concerns a life-threatening condition that will impact on their ability to even grow up and become an adult who might be able to autonomously decide. So I'm always referring just to the subset of intersex modifications that are not to do with an urgent physical health problem. And in case of penile circumcision, it's the same thing. In rare cases, you may have a medical indication for penile circumcision, but for the purposes of this course and the kinds of judgments that we're trying to draw out and evaluate, we're just referring to the medically unnecessary ones. Okay, so I've tried to say something about what appears to be a tension in the conservative gender view about which surgeries are permissible and which ones are impermissible in the case of male typical, female typical, intersex, and trans type surgeries. And I've suggested that according to the conservative legislation that's being passed, it's not a principled or a consistent view, it's more a view that has to do with maintaining the dominant gender norms. But what would a consistent or a principled view look like? So now I want to get into some of those distinctions between bodily integrity, bodily autonomy, and bodily intactness. My view of bodily integrity as distinct from bodily autonomy is that bodily integrity is a kind of a shield against interference with one's body that one has even when one is not autonomous. So this is similar to Katie Townsend's view that you read about last week. In the case of an adult who is autonomous, in other words, I'm conscious, I'm possessed of sound mind, I'm able to manage my own bodily boundaries, if you intrude into my bodily sphere to any extent without my consent, on some views, you violated my bodily autonomy. But now suppose I'm not autonomous. Let's say I've passed out. I'm sleeping. Well, it doesn't make sense to say you violated my right to be autonomous because I'm not autonomous. I can't be autonomous when I'm sleeping. Now, it might be that you violated my future right to be autonomous. So you've taken a choice from me that I ought to have been able to make when I woke up. If you come up to me and you touch my body or you fondle me in some way while I'm asleep, you violated my right to bodily autonomy. But some people would say, even if I don't have a right to bodily autonomy when I'm non-autonomous, because I'm sleeping, or passed out, or drunk, or whatever it might be, I still have a right to bodily integrity. And so, if non-autonomous persons have a right to bodily integrity, it's not really a right to bodily intactness. It's a right to a right against impermissible interference with one's body. So then there's still the question of, well, what are the permissible kinds and what are the impermissible kinds of interference with one's body? Some of you mentioned that, well, if you have to do an open heart surgery on a child, nobody would say that's impermissible, even though you're in some sense violating their bodily integrity. So what exactly is the rule? I've decided to assign a reading this week, which was my attempt to grapple with this question in a book chapter from a couple of years back. I try precisely to get at this issue. Um, if you have a child who uh, has a threatening health problem and it needs to be dealt with right away, then you have to say, well, it seems permissible for doctors to go ahead and perform a surgery to correct a heart problem. But why is it permissible exactly? One view is that it's permissible because it's what's all things considered best for the child, according to the judgments of the doctors and the parents. Another view is that it's permissible because it's what the child would consent to with almost absolute certainty if they were able to consent. So that's a sort of substituted judgment view, which is different from what the parents or the doctors judge to be in the child's best interests. And another view is that it does in fact violate the child's right to bodily integrity. It's just that they have a stronger right to life, which outweighs that right to bodily integrity. And so, although the one right is violated, that's allowed because it's necessary to defend an even more important right.